Thanks very much. I'm delighted to speak again after last year with you, and my presentation fits really well to what Paul just presented to you, just putting all of this in a global context. I want to just highlight that I can't share the slides or some of the slides with you right afterwards because they remain under embargo until the 13th of September. First, to talk a bit about the context. We have education generally in times of economic uncertainty. There's a continued strong demand for education. If you look at global trends, that's the first thing that you observe, that actually in almost any country in the industrialized world, there's a rapidly rising demand for education. And that also makes good sense as the opportunity costs at this point are obviously low. You don't want to do that when you have a booming economy. We also see substantial public and private gains from education. In most countries, in most industrialized countries, the earnings gain has continued to increase despite the large growth in the sector. Labor market entry obviously becomes more difficult, particularly for young and also lower educated workers. You're going to see some data on this. We see that education continues to be a good insurance against unemployment. So all of this says that we're going to see likely further rises in attainment and also rises in the demand for continuing education and training. Just sort of a highlight on the crisis. One of the things that you can see virtually in every country is that it has most affected those without baseline qualifications. If you look at those young people, older people without 5 good GCSEs or an upper secondary qualification, you can see this is how things looked in the year 2008. And this is how things got in 2009. You can see basically a dramatic increase in sort of unemployment among the young people in just 1 year. And when you now look at tertiary educated people, people to universities and colleges, you can see there's been a slight increase. But essentially, in most countries, people with good qualifications have been largely unaffected by the crisis over this current year. Sort of the gap between the better and poorer educated has dramatically risen. And that's something that we will see then obviously also in terms of social and economic outcomes. I just wanted to show you an updated version of a slide that I did show you at the last conference. Just the scale of change. And on the horizontal axis, I'm showing you the graduate supply, the proportion of people with a university degree. On the vertical axis, how much it costs per student, spending per student. And the size of the dot tells you where the money comes from. The larger the dot, the greater the share of private spending. And what you can see here is United States, #1 in terms of graduates, #1 in terms of spending per student, and #1 in terms of generating resources from the private sector through tuition. The only thing I haven't said so far that this was in 1995. And I just want to highlight the trends that we have seen in this. A couple of other countries, that's Japan, Finland, country we're going to talk about more in the next moment. But now look at how this changed. This was 95. You can see 5 years later, the world looked already very different. And this was the period where the UK saw very dramatic growth in the sector, higher education, becoming #1 in the year 2000. But the world continued to change. And you can see if you look at 2001, Australia now very much in front. Finland, the small dot coming out there, very much in front as well from the middle of the pack. And, of course, things continue to change. You can see in 2002. And now watch what happened to the United States. Now, that large dot going basically up through the roof, but not further. Now, whereas many countries are passing through that line. And you can see basically this is a country. And our analysis at this point is that the very, very high private burden on financing for higher education basically has cut off the supply there. You can see basically how the United States has got from #1 in 2007, doesn't make it very different, from #1 to just an average performer in terms of graduate output in the economy. So dramatic changes in a very, very small period of history. You can move from the middle of the pack to the front line, or you can fall from #1 to just an average performer in a very, very short period of time of history. What's driving those changes? Those are the kind of things we're going to watch now. Well, this is 2008. I just wanted to highlight, this is a new aspect that we looked at this time. We have not only looked at the industrialized world, but try to look at the G20 countries. And basically you can see when you look at the older generation, those people now moving out of the labor force, you have about 39 million people with a tertiary qualification, and if you look at the young people, it's 81 million. So you can see basically this is doubled over that generation. And now look at how the composition has changed. Basically, if you look at the past, you could see the United States 31%, 32%, then Japan, China, Germany, United Kingdom, and so on. But when you look at how things look a generation later, you can see the United States is just about 18%. You can see Japan 9.5%, China 16%. So you can see basically it's not just an expansion, but there's a very, very different sort of scale of expansion across countries, with the result that market shares have changed quite a bit. Now, if you look towards the future, you don't look at those who have a degree, but you look at those who enter university now, and you can see basically the picture looks like this. You can see China coming out with a very, very large share of the cake, and then the United States shrunk to 13%, and Russian Federation with some growth, and so on, but basically a quite different picture that we're looking at. This doesn't tell you anything about quality. No, this is just basically the number of people now entering university before us was coming out. But basically a very, very different composition of the global talent pool as we know it. Interesting point, I think Paul has already pointed to this, is that the increase in the number of knowledge workers hasn't led to a decline in the pay, which is what you're seeing at the low end of the skill spectrum. Right? You see this dramatic depreciation of that part, where you see declining wages in real terms or growing unemployment, however it expresses itself in different countries. These are our latest data on this. You can basically look at all the costs and benefits of higher education. This is 2007 data, 2008 data for some countries, so it doesn't take into account, obviously, the most recent reform. You have basically direct costs. Foregone earnings is what's driving the cost for most young people, and that really remains true after even your most recent reforms. It's not the tuition that people pay, it's what they don't earn when they study, which is driving sort of their cost of higher education. You then have, in some countries, huge income tax effects. No? That's basically what you pay back later. By being better qualified and having a better paid job, you have then also sort of social contribution effects that sort of take away money from you. But then basically you can see the lifetime earnings actually are a lot more than all of those costs together. Then you can look at employment benefits. You have lower risk of unemployment. And you average this out. You look at basically a net present value in the UK of $200,000. That's quite a lot of money that comes out of you as an individual. I just wanted to sort of highlight, this is sort of just a schematic presentation of how this has changed over time. The green sort of symbols tell you that the earnings advantage is rising further, and you can see a couple of countries where there are actually dramatic rises in the earnings advantage of better educated people. You can see Germany 22%, Luxembourg 90%, sort of those countries expand the sector, but the demand for higher skills is rising a lot faster than supply. And yellow is sort of so things haven't really changed. There are just a couple of countries really where you have seen a marked decline in the relative earnings over the last years. You can do the same thing for secondary, that's not so interesting. I just wanted to highlight an aspect that is actually very, very new in our analysis. One of the things that we have done just last year, we're actually currently working on this. We have done, you're familiar with the PISA study, we have done a PISA for adults. We have done an assessment of what people can actually do, testing the skills of people and looking at the skills they have, how they use them, and how that translates into different economic and social outcomes. And I think that's a very, very important facet for your debate here, basically looking at those kind of things. You can map people by their skills from high skills, green, to low skills in red. And then you can basically see what does this level of skill do to you. And you can see the first thing is that having low skills, being in the red area, is increasing your risk of having poor health. Obviously, you don't know what cause and effect is. If you have poor skills, you end up with those kind of jobs that are probably more at risk. But I think it's important to see that relationship. does not volunteer or charity or non-profit organizations. So also that is something that actually does relate to the kind of skills that you have. Poor understanding of political issues facing your country. Poor level of general trust, also that's something quite highly related to skills. Now you can say, well, why does the OECD, an organization for economy, look at levels of general trust? Well, it's quite obvious, because every business relationship is founded on trust. If you don't trust public institutions, you don't get a very well-functioning society. So those things actually matter for societies, and you can actually see those things are not in the abstract. They actually have a quite significant relationship to the kind of skills people have and use. Here is also interesting, higher propensity of people trying to take advantage of others. Now, if you actually are poorly skilled, basically particularly below level 3 on that scale, you always believe that others are cheating you. You don't trust in other people. You can also look at the propensity to reciprocate. Do I give back what I've got from others? Or poor political efficacy. People with low skills believing basically all these politicians do what they want. I have actually no influence on what happens in my country. So you can actually see there are lots of facets of society, not just earnings, that actually depend quite closely on the level of skills that people have. Now, why did I use skills and not levels of formal education? Because it doesn't work well with formal education. It works much better when we look at the skills people can actually demonstrate. Now, we have talked about benefits for individuals. The question, obviously, and I think Paul's analysis points to us as well, is, what does this all mean for taxpayers? And I showed you last year some initial data on this. We have now actually a lot better data on that. You can see here, these are the public costs. Now, red, basically the investment that governments make in higher education, and in green, the public benefits. Now, because obviously governments in the long term earn money by people paying higher taxes with better levels of education. You can actually see that in every country of the OECD, the government actually makes a lot of money of better educated people. And also that has been increasing across countries. In the UK, it's about $95,000 basically per graduate that the government actually gets more than it invested in that person earlier in their life by helping them obtaining a degree. So it's a very important facet of the picture. There are individual benefits, there are social benefits, there are fiscal benefits across the OECD countries. You can always ask yourself, and that's a perennial debate, is education really helping our economies, or is it really sort of consumption? And I think that very much is important in the question sort of who pays for education. If it's consumption good, you want to charge individuals. If it's something that helps societies and economies, you want to make sure that societies invest. And basically, one way to look at this is actually who's ending up in a skilled profession. And you can see the UK is actually doing quite well on that. You have still a lot of people with tertiary qualifications. In the long term, the UK is going to sort of downwards because it has sort of not seen the kind of recent rises that other countries have seen. But it has a quite good talent pool in terms of better qualified people. And actually, most of these people end up doing work that requires the kind of skill levels that those people have. So basically, you can argue that much of the investment actually benefits the kind of jobs that people take on later in their lives. I think that's a very important facet of that analysis as well. Just a couple of slides. It doesn't sort of fit directly into the theme, but I think it's an important aspect is international mobility. We have actually seen a dramatic continued rise in tertiary students. We have now 3.7 million tertiary students that were enrolled out of their country of citizenship in the area that we're looking in. We have entirely new players coming into this. Australia is not a particularly new player, but one that actually has been very successful in further expanding its market share. The Russian Federation as well, quite new in this and quite a big. Korea, New Zealand, Spain also, a bit at least. The losers here is mainly the United States, Germany, the UK, Belgium, and in terms of relative losses. Absolute numbers continue to increase in virtually every country, but it's obviously a question of market share. Here you have just the numbers That's sort of the global trend in the OECD countries, in EU countries, in G20 countries, North America, sort of everywhere. That trend is going up and almost by similar margins. If you look at this by country, you can see the United States is a favorite destination for lots of students, but actually that's just true in absolute terms. If you look nowadays, the UK, relative to the size of the tertiary sector, is a lot more successful than the US in sort of getting tertiary students enrolled. It's just that it's a smaller system. And the same is true for Australia, even more so. Australia is, you can see that actually, I think I have a chart on that. Yeah, you can actually see that when you look at this in relative terms, that the UK comes number 2, slightly down, but sort of quite successful in sort of raising proportions. One of the things I wanted to sort of, is also a new piece of analysis. People talk about immigrants now. Sort of foreign students basically coming into the country for the purpose of obtaining a degree. You charge them a lot. No? They pay a high price in the UK, they pay a low price in other countries. So to what extent, and you charge them a lot because you work on the assumptions that they may just go back to their country so that you don't end up with the benefits. But actually, for the first time been measuring this, and you can actually see that you have a quarter of people actually who remain in the country. And from those numbers, you do actually see that it's a really good investment to keep those, to educate foreign graduates in your country. I mean, the marginal cost of adding a tertiary degree over the total investment education is comparatively low. And you can actually see that national economies drive significant benefits from a fair share of those people actually staying in the country of study. And the UK is sort of coming out quite well on that chart as well. Where do those people come from? I think that's a picture that is actually not that dramatically changing. China is a big supplier. India, Korea, Germany, France, and so on, United States. That's basically where foreign students in the OECD area come, and then lots of people come from outside the OECD area. But that's a picture I don't think we have seen dramatic changes. I want to spend the last few minutes on this important question of who pays for all of this, and how does it work across countries. This is basically expenditure on educational services, and I distinguish here between total expenditure and educational core services, what you see in white, then auxiliary service in green, and in red, research and development, in relation to spending capacity, sort of GDP per capita. This is how a country comes out. I mean, you've seen that already. United States, Korea, Canada, Chile, Finland actually being the big investors. The UK comes rather at the low end of the spectrum, but with a quite significant share on research spending. If you basically look in total spending, sort of a fair share of that goes actually to research and development. Downside is obviously that spending on teaching is actually quite low relative to GDP, to national investment. On a per student basis, it looks slightly better. The UK becomes an average spender. But if you look at this over time, actually, the UK has actually been one of the countries with the biggest rises in spending. You can see here basically the dark yellow bar is money being invested, change in spending between 2000 and 2008. Again, something that Paul already hinted to, that the UK has seen sort of a dramatic expansion of its public budget, and that was true for higher education as well. And that expansion was quite significantly larger than actually growth in student numbers, with the result that spending per student has risen by 30%. That doesn't mean it's high. It's still just sort of around the average. But basically, you've seen quite significant decreases. Has not been true in all countries. No? Every country has increased its spending and its investment, but in a number of countries, sort of large, significantly rising student numbers have eaten most of that up, so that you actually see a couple of countries with declining volume of resources per student. Share of private expenditure, obviously that's a very relevant topic for you at this time, and you can actually see that the UK now just comes after Chile, Korea, and Japan, even before the United States. That's something that, and obviously with the current reforms, that balance will change further, but in 2008 you could see, if you look at the red dot, it's about 2000. If you look at 2008, the share of private spending has actually doubled, putting the UK now towards really one end of the spectrum. And you can see that also when you look at levels of tuition fees. This is just the United States and Korea, which come on top of the United States. And what you also have to see is that actually the United States, they have very, very high tuition fees, but they also have a very high share, 70% of students who have actually access to grants and loans. So that's a part of the equation you always have to consider. But this is the picture, you know, if you remember last year's picture, looked quite a bit different. This is where actual change, real change has happened in the UK. And you can also, and that's going to be more or less the end of it, you can basically balance the public costs and private costs. And there also you can see, when you look at the different forms of private costs, now the spending I have for tuition in dark blue, then what I don't earn because I study in light blue. And you can see that the public investment and public foregone earning, people don't pay taxes. You can actually see also here that the UK also there comes out now after the Netherlands on top in terms of the balance, tilting sort of to the left hand on the side. But both parts of the costs are actually quite high on that chart. Well, that's all actually I wanted to